Buongiorno a tutti, good morning to everybody. First of all, I want to thank General Miglietta and General Farina for inviting me to this webinar. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you this morning. I would talk about Russia and China economic engagement with the countries of the area known as MENA, which are notably different based on both economic capacity and their own different history. So I begin with China. In September 2013, in a speech at University of Nazarbayev in Astana, in Kazakhstan, the president of China, Xi Jinping, alluded to the Silk Road economic belt as a modern version of the mythical trade route that crossed Asia for centuries. He based the project on 5 points. First of all, political dialogue between the countries along the route. Second, construction of a transport infrastructure network made up of new railway lines, roads, and oil and gas pipelines to and from China. 3, eliminating barriers on good movements, creating free trade zones and facilitating trade flows. And 4, promoting trade in local currencies. And 5, promoting cultural exchanges between populations. The first plan was formally presented at the Asia Forum in Brau in March 2015 as One Belt, One Road, popularly known as the New Silk Road. It is obvious that for China, the project combines its domestic economic interests and its foreign policy ambitions. Even before the launch of this ambitious project, China began to take up positions in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, in 2015, China became the world's largest oil importer, with 50% coming from the Middle East. And since then, it has become the main investor and trading partner for many of the countries of the region. This implies a growing economic presence that could lead to the emergence of a serious competitor to Western influence in the region at all levels. If we take into account the relevance of these countries as suppliers of natural gas for China, we must pay attention to their presence in their energy companies and to their essential role as a global geostrategic variable. In this environment, it is worth highlighting the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which through Pakistan and with the creation of a powerful infrastructure network, will connect Western China with the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, facilitating trade with Middle Eastern countries, from the port of Gwadar in Balochistan, Pakistan, to Kashgar in China. Middle Eastern leaders have welcomed the projects of the new route, increasing their economic and financial ties with Beijing. In particular, the largest energy projects are in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, not to mention Iran. But construction projects have also been developed enormously in the transport, real estate, and metallurgical sectors. For example, in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and also in Algeria. One may say that the Chinese strategy in the Middle East has been developed through the One Belt, One Road, and is designed not only to guarantee energy resources, but also through investment in infrastructure to export its excess of productive capacity in goods such as steel or aluminum, while creating at the same time new markets in the Middle East for Chinese goods and services. From the point of view of the countries in the area, the strategy is also very attractive. Firstly, major infrastructure projects involve huge investments with their multiplier effect on local economies. Secondly, the infrastructure networks will make internal economic activity more dynamic. And finally, it will also serve to compensate the trade deficit with China, which in some of these countries in the area is extremely high. In this sense, the Chinese strategy must be differentiated by countries. Classic bilateral trade schemes can be maintained with rich countries, energy producers, making significant investments in energy projects together with considerable energy imports. However, in more depressed economies, investments must focus on infrastructure and transport, aimed at the reactivation of local economies and with a predictable return in the long term. As a global counterpart, the situation can entail considerable political influence in these countries, as it generates very strong dependence in their economies. On the other hand, the economic relationship between China and the North African countries must be analyzed from the global approaches of the Asian power with respect to the African continent. It is true that they can be supported by two relevant historical factors. On the one hand, the relations of the Chinese and the Africans go back to the voyages of the Chinese imperial fleet at the beginning of the 15th century, 100 years before the first European expeditions arrives to Africa. Secondly, and most important, unlike European countries, China has no colonizing past in Africa. It has never had direct possessions in the continent, which allows it to negotiate from a position of theoretical equality. In fact, some authors have pointed out that China exploits its past victimized by Western imperialism. For an economy characterized by strong growth like the Chinese, Africa is absolutely essential. The increasing need for natural resources to maintain its growth rates makes the African continent a strategic factor in its economic policy. That is why, although China's presence in Africa began to develop significantly some more or less 20 years ago, its progress has been truly impressive, largely at the expense of Western countries. The impact generated in the countries receiving the investment from China can be seen either of partners for development or economic competitors or colonizing power. The fact is that it could be a mixture of all of them, which suggests that it will become a more or less stable relationship in the long term. Although initially the idea of the New Silk Road was focused on a terrestrial economic belt to link China with Europe through Central Asia, and a maritime route to connect China with Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, from China, but also from abroad, many voices argued the convenience of including the African continent in this great project. And finally, in 2016, China reached an agreement with the African Union aimed at connecting the 54 African countries through a modern network of transport infrastructures. Officially, this project does not belong to the route, but the links between the two are quite evident. Obviously, this approach starts from two premises. On the one hand, China can succeed in transferring part of its labor-intensive industrial sectors to Africa. On the other hand, the African population can benefit from the growth of their economies, with its implications for job creation and knowledge transfer. In any case, it should be understood that this project, though important for both parties, would be of second-level priority for China, and its implementation would probably be slower. We refer to the origin of Chinese economic growth based on the conversion of this country into what has been known as the factory of the world, a role that it has played with great efficiency in recent decades. Historically, the great economic powers have derived part of their success from knowledge and technology, leaving the productive work for less developed countries, with much lower production costs. Inevitably, as an economic power, China has turned to a new internal economic model based on training and technology, sectors in which the progress in the last 2 decades has been really spectacular, and therefore on the search for a new image as a global economic power. Additionally, the rise in GDP per capita has led to an increase in production costs, which in the medium and long term requires a search for territories that would allow them to be minimized. The conclusion is obvious. China wants to lose its status as a manufacturer and make Africa the world's new factory. To put it more precisely, a future for Chinese factories in Africa is outlined, which its implication in terms of improving the economic situation of African countries and the appropriation by Chinese companies of a significant part of the growth of the world economy. However, these considerations do not apply to the entire continent. Due to its special characteristics, the need for basic investments in infrastructure and the search for low cost, the target territory is sub-Saharan Africa, rather than the northern countries. Let us not forget that these present higher ratios of GDP per capita and, to a certain degree, of local industry development, together, of course, with higher labor costs. That is why Chinese investors in the northern area have focused mainly on 2 countries, and for very relevant strategic reasons. In the first place, Egypt, due to its geopolitical importance, reflected mainly by the Suez Channel and the ports of Alexandria and Suez, and more strictly in North Africa. And Algeria, a key country in the supply of energy and some raw materials. It is also clear that the economic, political, social, cultural, and religious difference between China and the countries of North Africa pose important barriers that are difficult to overcome, which encourage a trend or displaces Chinese investments to other African countries. But let's talk about Russia and the MENA countries. The economic relations between Russia and the MENA countries are highly conditioned by the economic situation of one of the great powers of the Cold War, and by the political relations that were established in the communist area during the 20th century. The links established in the recent years with Europe and the USA have progressively weakened, so their international agenda led them to strengthen ties with the former Soviet republics. However, with the exception of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Armenia, these have not prospered, leading them to seek shelter with the BRICS countries. But also in this case, the Russian expansion goals did not bear fruit, leading to a search for relationships with alternative emerging countries. It is here when some MENA countries appear. Historically, the USSR paid little attention to African countries, with the exception of its satellite states, and became more internally involved in the Middle East as the playing field of the Cold War, due mainly to the US support to Israel. In North Africa, its economic and also political relations were concentrated in Algeria and Libya, and in the Middle East, especially in Iraq and Syria, together with Egypt, mainly after Nasser's break with the USA. The current general situation in no way favors Russia's economic commitment with these key countries in the MENA zone. First of all, because of the fall of the Soviet economic model, along with the collapse of their trade, particularly with the Soviet publics. So since then, and given the non-existent modernization of its economic model, the Russian economy has been highly dependent on their raw materials. The existence of a market with a very clear tendency to oligopoly, the lack of modernization of its industrial sector, and the large amount of corruption caused the Russian economy to depend on oil price fluctuations on the international market. Almost 70% of the state budget is financed by energy exports, oil and gas, mainly to Europe. The degree of dependency is clearly accessible. In this situation, Russia's chances of intervening economically outside its borders are seriously conditioned. Interestingly, and despite sharing borders, China, which is the world's leading energy consumer, and Russia, which is the world's second largest energy producer, have had very little interaction in this regard. However, there are good reasons for the development of bilateral relations on energy, which are related to the difficult situation of pollution management in China, caused by generating 70% of its energy from coal, the most polluting source and the cause of multiple public health problems. However, only 4% comes from natural gas, which is much less polluting. On the other hand, Russian natural gas exports have fallen in recent years and will do so more in the future due to the growth of renewable energy sources in Europe. Consequently, Russia needs new markets for its natural gas in particular and its energy in general. And here, the relations between the two countries can be strengthened. China can increase its purchase of natural gas from China and also allow this country to find new markets around the new Silk Road. This general framework could provide the answer to the discussions generated in Moscow on whether the economic, the land belt of the Silk Road endangered Russian interests in Central Asia, represented, as you know, by the Eurasian Economic Union. President Putin himself considers it more an opportunity than a threat. And in May 2015, signed a joint declaration on the interpretation of both projects, although its content focused on the political level and offered very vague proposals. What is clear is that the future of these relations, and therefore of Russia's actions in the MENA area, is strongly conditioned by the evolution of the new Silk Road. Faced with such a situation, the protectionist obsession with foreign competition and the lack of interest in stimulating it by internal demand are of no help from the future of the Russian economy. And finally, I want to talk about the Chinese model and its dangers. In short, the Chinese model for economic cooperation with the MENA zone can be said to be based on two ideas. First, industrial cooperation, aimed at accelerating the industrialization and modernization of economics with a low level of development. In strictly economic and commercial terms, a win-win relationship is generated. Chinese capital and technology compensated with natural resources and labor from the target countries. The transfer of labor-intensive industrial sectors abroad generates a double benefit: development for receivers and efficiency for China. Second, strategic and integrating relationship. As a corollary to strong economic and trade relations, China's commitment also has political and security implications, as peace and stability are required in the target countries to ensure economic success. This means a Chinese military expansion, especially in Africa. As an example, its military base in Djibouti, which Western countries must take into account.
I beg your pardon, Professor Corona, 3 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. A very large part of Chinese financing in these countries comes in the form of loans and investments. I see, not subsidies, usually backed by natural resources. The often downward evolution of the prices of the basic products, together with many years of a spectacular growth, can condition the viability of loan repayment. A global view of this entire process allows us to appreciate the spectacular growth of Chinese investment so far this century through an aggressive financial policy that allows loans to be offered with state aid at very low interest rates and for very long terms. Many of these have been channeled towards infrastructure projects. It is not surprising that some voices are raised speaking of an infrastructure bubble. Faced with this scenario, it is advisable to analyze the capacity of China's economy, the second largest production economy in the world, but also the second most indebted. In this regard, it must be remembered that most of the loans come from state banks. If there are problems in the returns, the Chinese government will have to come to the aid, worsening the country's indebtedness. The ability to repay loans, which is difficult in many cases, has been worsened by the economic consequences of COVID-19, leading institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to request debt suspensions to stimulate the recovery, which will significantly affect China. In practice, it has already been forced to write off interest-free credits to some countries, which obviously are not exempt from some kind of compensation. China is likely to participate in selective debt forgiveness programs with institutions such as the International Monetary Fund to save the situation, but always based on negotiations in which natural resources and strategically relevant infrastructures will play a very important role. It is therefore worth considering the possibility that the new Silk Road model has a less visible goal related to geostrategic control, that we can say soft power, through the creation of the trapped debt to gain control of strategic infrastructures and even governments. And I think this is very, very important for the Western countries. Thank you very much.